A man stands in a paddock full of yellow flowers with his 4 daughters beside him. He spent his whole life building a cattle property that's been in his family for generations. And in one budget announcement, the government just told him that the future he planned for his daughters is no longer guaranteed. This is the story of how a single tax rule, buried deep inside a federal budget, is quietly forcing Australian cattle families to choose between holding on to the land their ancestors cleared and selling it off to survive. His name is Tony Flannery. He runs a family cattle operation, and like tens of thousands of other Australian farmers, his family's wealth isn't sitting in a bank account or a share portfolio. It's standing in a paddock, grazing on grass, wearing an ear tag. It's tied up in dirt that's been worked for generations, in fences his father built, in a homestead his grandmother lived in. And like most of those farmers, Tony doesn't own that land directly. He owns it through something called a discretionary family trust. And that small legal detail is exactly why his family, and thousands like his, are suddenly staring down a very different future than the one they planned for. To understand why this matters, you have to understand why farmers use trusts in the first place. A discretionary trust isn't some clever accounting trick invented to dodge tax. For most cattle families, it's a survival tool. Farming is one of the riskiest businesses in the country. A single bad season, a market crash, a drought, a flood, a divorce inside the family, or the sudden death of a parent can wipe out decades of work if the assets aren't protected properly. A trust allows a farming family to hold the property, the herd, the machinery, and the income in a structure that can't easily be torn apart by a lawsuit, bankruptcy, or a messy divorce settlement. It also lets the family split income between multiple family members, so that instead of one person paying tax at the top marginal rate, the income can be shared out and taxed more fairly across the people actually working the land. But the real power of a trust, the reason cattle families cling to it so tightly, is what it does for succession. When a farmer dies, or when they're ready to hand the reins to their kids, control of the trust can pass to the next generation without triggering a capital gains tax event. The land itself never technically changes hands in a way that forces a tax bill. 4 different properties owned by the same trust can be divided up between 4 different children, according to who wants to keep farming and who doesn't, without the whole family being torn apart by an enormous tax liability the moment the old fella passes away. For generations, this has been the quiet machinery that let cattle stations move from parent to child, and from child to grandchild, without the government taking a massive cut every single time. There are roughly 40,000 of these trusts across Australia holding primary producer income, 40,000 farming families relying on a structure that, for decades, worked quietly in the background, barely discussed outside of accountants' offices and kitchen table conversations about wills. And then, in 2026, the federal government decided it was time to close what it saw as a loophole. Discretionary trusts, more broadly, have been used by wealthy families and businesses across the country to minimize tax by distributing income to family members in lower tax brackets, sometimes including children or retirees who pay very little tax at all. Treasury looked at that pattern and decided the system needed an overhaul. And when the Treasurer stood up and announced sweeping reform to how trusts are taxed in this country, cattle families across Australia felt the ground shift under their boots. The proposal on the table was blunt: a flat 30% minimum tax on trust distributions. Instead of income flowing out to family members and being taxed at their individual marginal rates, which for a lot of farming families meant relatively low effective tax, the government wanted trustees to pay 30% upfront, no matter who the money eventually landed with. On paper, it was designed to stop wealthy families from parking income with low-earning relatives purely to avoid tax. In practice, it would have applied to every single one of those 40,000 farm trusts, regardless of whether the family behind it was minimizing tax aggressively or simply trying to keep a modest cattle property running from one generation to the next. The reaction from the bush was immediate and furious. The National Farmers Federation, the peak body representing Australian agriculture, described the proposal in the starkest possible terms. Its chief executive, Mike Guerin, said that without a carve-out for farming income, the policy could have destroyed agriculture in its current form as a family-owned enterprise within a generation. That is not a throwaway line. That is the peak body for the entire Australian farm sector telling the government, in plain language, that a tax policy aimed at closing loopholes for the wealthy was about to take down the ordinary family farm along with it. More than 840,000 discretionary trusts operate across Australia in total, and under the proposed new framework, trustees of every one of them would have been forced to pay that flat 30% tax up front, replacing the system farmers had built their entire succession planning around. Nationals leader Matt Canavan didn't hold back either. He accused the government of trying to rush through the biggest structural reforms to the tax system in 20 years without proper scrutiny. He said the Nationals simply would not support increases in taxes on the Australian people, and he pushed, alongside Liberal leader Angus Taylor, for a full Senate inquiry into the changes before they went anywhere near a vote in Parliament. Independent senators and crossbench MPs started pushing in the same direction, worried about the long-term economic impact on regional Australia. What had started as a fairly technical tax reform buried inside a federal budget was quickly turning into one of the biggest political fights of the year, and cattle country was right at the center of it. Under mounting pressure, the government blinked, at least partially. It agreed to carve out primary producer income from the flat 30% trust tax. In other words, income earned specifically from farming activities, running cattle, growing crops, working the land in the traditional sense, would be exempt from the new flat rate and could continue to be distributed and taxed the old way. Mike Guerin called securing that carve-out vital, and it genuinely was a win. Without it, the modeling suggested genuine damage to the structure of family farming across the country. But here's the part that gets lost in the celebration, and the part that matters most if you're trying to understand why cattle families are still worried. The carve-out only protects income that comes directly from farming. It does nothing for a huge and growing slice of what modern cattle operations actually earn their money from. Because here's the thing about the modern Australian cattle property. It's rarely just cattle anymore. Farmers have diversified out of pure necessity, chasing extra income streams to survive volatile seasons and unpredictable markets. Farm stays, where tourists come and pay to experience life on the land, small wineries planted on marginal country, renewable energy projects with solar and wind leases now dotting properties across the country, livestock transport businesses running alongside the cattle operation itself, agronomy consulting. All of that income, everything that isn't strictly classified as primary production, still gets caught by the new 30% minimum tax. So a cattle family that spent the last decade smartly diversifying to protect themselves from drought and market swings is now being taxed more heavily on exactly the strategy that was supposed to make them more resilient. And on top of that, retired farmers who lease their land back to their children or to a neighbor through the trust structure are also caught by the new rules, because that leasing income doesn't count as primary production either. But as significant as the trust changes are, they're not actually the part of this reform that keeps cattle families up at night. The bigger sting, the one that could genuinely reshape who owns farmland in this country over the next decade, is the overhaul of capital gains tax. Here's how it used to work. If a farm was purchased before capital gains tax was introduced in Australia back in 1985, the seller paid no capital gains tax on it at all when they sold. It was grandfathered out of the system entirely. On top of that, for any asset bought after 1985 and held for more than 12 months, sellers got a 50% discount on the taxable portion of their capital gain. Together, those two settings meant that a lot of long-held family cattle properties could be sold or transferred with a manageable tax outcome, even after decades of the land appreciating enormously in value. Both of those settings are being torn up. From the 1st of July, 2027, the existing 50% capital gains discount is being scrapped for assets held longer than 12 months. In its place comes a system of inflation-adjusted indexation, alongside a new minimum 30% tax rate applied to capital gains. And for those old pre-1985 properties, the ones that used to escape capital gains tax entirely, owners are now going to be required to get them formally valued as of the 30th of June, 2027. From that valuation date forward, any increase in value will become fully taxable the moment the property is sold. Decades of untaxed depreciation are being locked in as a starting point, and everything the land gains in value from here on will be captured by the tax office. To understand what that actually means in dollars and not just in policy language, it helps to look at the numbers one commercial and property lawyer worked through. Georgiana Ryan has spent 40 years advising farming families on tax, agribusiness, and water law, and she lives on a farm herself, so this isn't an abstract exercise for her. She took a genuinely typical rural property in her area and ran the maths under both the old rules and the new ones. Picture 1,000 acres bought back in 2003 for around $500 an acre, so $500,000 in total. Fast forward to today, and based on the most recent valuer, general figures, that same land is worth around $5,600 an acre. That's $5,600,000. A staggering increase, but not an unusual one in regional Australia, where land values have climbed relentlessly for 2 decades. Under the old rules, allowing for around $100 an acre in costs like stamp duty and improvements over the years, giving a cost base of about $600,000, the capital gain on that property works out to around $5,000 an acre or $5 million in total. Apply the old 50% discount, and the taxable gain drops to $2.5 million. Leaving aside any other income the family might have, the tax bill on that comes to just over $1,091,000. Now run the same property through the new rules. Instead of a flat discount, the cost base gets adjusted using the Consumer Price Index, tracking inflation from 2003 through to 2025. Under that calculation, the adjusted cost base comes out at around $1,076 an acre, or just over $1 million. That leaves a taxable gain of roughly $4,524,000. Apply the new rules, and the tax bill jumps to just over $2 million. That's an extra $910,800 in tax on the exact same piece of land, purely because of the change in how the gain is calculated. Nearly $1 million in additional tax on a modest, ordinary-sized cattle property, not some sprawling corporate megastation. For a lot of families, that kind of number isn't an inconvenience. It's the difference between a viable transfer to the next generation and a forced sale just to cover the tax office. And this is where the small business concessions were supposed to step in as a safety net. Under the existing rules, if a farm's turnover sits below $2 million, or if the net value of its assets sits under $6 million, the business can qualify for small business capital gains tax concessions, which can significantly reduce, or in some cases entirely eliminate, the tax owed when the property is sold. A Treasury spokesperson confirmed that this meant eligible farmers could pay reduced tax, or none at all, when they sold up. That sounds like exactly the kind of protection cattle families need. The problem is that $6 million asset threshold hasn't moved in almost 20 years. It was set back in 2007, and it has sat frozen in place ever since, while the value of Australian farmland has climbed dramatically year after year. A cattle property that would have comfortably sat under that $6 million cap 2 decades ago can now be worth 2 or 3 times that, purely from land value appreciation without the family doing anything differently at all. The threshold hasn't kept up with reality, and more genuine, ordinary family farms are finding themselves priced out of the very concession that was designed to protect them. Peter Knights is a farmer and an accountant, which puts him in a rare position to see this from both sides of the fence. He's watching the practical human consequence of that frozen threshold play out with his own clients. More and more of them, he says, are finding themselves outside those thresholds, precisely at the moment when it would make the most sense to transfer the farm to the next generation. And so, rather than hand over the property while the kids are young and full of energy and ready to take on the risk, families are simply holding on, sitting on the asset for longer than makes practical sense, purely to avoid triggering a tax bill they can't afford. Peter put it about as plainly as it can be put. The people who have the appetite to produce don't get the asset. Think about what that actually means for Australian agriculture over the next 20 years. It means the generational handover that's supposed to keep farms productive and driven by people with fresh energy and new ideas gets delayed, sometimes for years, sometimes indefinitely. Because the tax system makes holding on the safer financial choice, even when it isn't the better choice for the farm, for the family, or for the country's food production. This is the succession trap that farm leaders keep warning about, and it isn't limited to the $6 million threshold. Hamish McIntyre, president of the National Farmers Federation, has been blunt about what's at stake. Family farms, he says, often represent a farmer's entire life savings, built up carefully over decades, meant to fund their retirement and hand a genuine pathway to their children or grandchildren to keep working the land. He's warned that without proper protection built into these changes, the country risks decreased investment in agriculture, delayed succession, farmers taking on more debt just to bridge the gap, and in some cases, outright forced sales of farmland purely to meet a tax bill that has nothing to do with how the farm is actually performing. He said the government still has time to get this right, but that the message from agriculture is clear. The last thing this country should be doing is making it harder for the next generation to stay on the land. The political fight over all of this has been loud and it hasn't let up. Matt Canavan has argued that these changes could actually let the biggest players off comparatively lightly, while ordinary family cattle operations get hit the hardest. His argument is that large corporates and certain superannuation-linked farming vehicles will find structural ways around the new rules, the same way big money often finds a path through complicated tax law, while it's the average mom and dad family farm, the ones without a battalion of tax lawyers and structuring specialists on retainer, that end up carrying the real weight of the reform. Some international investors, he's warned, could end up paying less tax under the new arrangements than an ordinary Australian farming family selling their own land. Whether or not that plays out exactly as he describes, the political message landed hard in rural communities already feeling like they weren't being properly consulted. And that sense of being shut out of the process became its own flashpoint. Before one of the government's later concessions was even announced, farm groups revealed that neither the National Farmers Federation nor any other farming body had been invited to formally address the Senate committee hearing evidence on the legislation. Publics. Hearings were held over 2 days in June of 2026, with input from the broader business sector, from tech startups, from mining and exploration interests, but not, in person, from the farmers whose land and livelihoods sat right at the center of the debate. For an industry representing something like 80,000 farm businesses across the country, that omission stung. It reinforced a feeling that had been building in the bush for months, that decisions with enormous consequences for cattle families were being made in Canberra boardrooms, largely without cattle families actually being in the room. Not everyone sees this reform as an attack on farmers, though, and it's worth being fair to that side of the argument, too. Shumi Akhtar, an associate professor at the University of Sydney Business School, has pointed out that the government's underlying goal isn't to punish genuine, hard-working farming families at all. It's aimed at closing loopholes that get exploited by people well outside the traditional definition of a farmer. Some of those loopholes, she's noted, get used by international investors structuring their money to look like farm investment purely to access favorable tax treatment, when the actual intent has nothing to do with running cattle or growing crops. Her argument is that the government isn't going after genuine, innocent farmers. It's trying to hold the actual bad actors accountable, the ones gaming a system that was never designed with them in mind. She's also been careful to point out that no final, clear-cut legislation has been locked in yet, and that farmers need to wait for the detailed legislation before assuming the very worst version of these changes is what actually ends up on the books. That pressure campaign from the Bush did eventually produce real, tangible movement. In the middle of June 2026, just days after farm groups had been left out of that Senate inquiry, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stood up and announced a significant change to the small business concession. The turnover threshold for the existing small business, 50% active, asset capital gains, tax reduction would rise from $2 million up to $10 million. In the Prime Minister's own words, the changes were about providing more clarity and confidence to investors, more support for small businesses, and more incentive for innovation. And they recognized that more farming families needed to be able to access this kind of support when they're transitioning assets, investing in productivity or planning for succession. For thousands of cattle operations that had grown beyond the old $2 million turnover cap purely through inflation and rising costs rather than genuine expansion, this was a real and immediate win. The National Farmers Federation welcomed it as one of the single most consequential outcomes it had secured in the entire fight, a genuine, measurable improvement to the settings farming families would actually be operating under. But even with that win banked, farm leaders were quick to point out that the fight isn't over because the turnover threshold was never really the central problem. The net asset value cap, that $6 million ceiling that hasn't moved since 2007, is still sitting there completely untouched. And for a huge number of cattle properties, particularly anywhere with strong land values, that asset test is the one actually keeping them locked out of the concession, regardless of what happens with turnover. Hamish McIntyre has continued to push on exactly this point, arguing that those thresholds are badly outdated and no longer reflect the reality of family farming in 2026. His stated priority going forward is getting those settings properly reviewed, specifically to protect farm succession and head off unintended consequences for the next generation of farmers before this legislation is fully locked in. So where does all of this leave a family like Tony Flannery's, or the tens of thousands of other cattle families scattered across Australia's grazing country, watching this play out from their own kitchen tables? The honest answer is that it leaves them in a genuinely uncertain place, and that uncertainty is itself doing damage, well before a single extra dollar of tax has actually changed hands. Families are talking to their accountants right now, trying to model out what their own specific situation looks like under rules that in some cases haven't even been fully finalized yet. Some are seriously considering whether now is the moment to transfer control of the farm to the next generation, hurrying to lock in more favorable treatment before the July 2027 changes fully land. Others are doing the opposite, deciding to sit tight and delay handover entirely, worried that acting too early under still shifting rules could end up costing them even more than waiting would. It's also worth remembering that this isn't the first time Australian cattle families have found themselves blindsided by a decision made a long way from the paddock. Back in 2011, the federal government suddenly banned live cattle exports to Indonesia, virtually overnight, after footage of animal cruelty in Indonesian abattoirs sparked national outrage. Northern cattle stations, entire regional economies built around that export trade, were plunged into chaos with almost no warning and no time to adjust. Families like the Bretts of Waterloo Station in the Northern Territory became the public face of that fight, spending more than a decade in the courts trying to recover compensation for losses that, in their telling, lasted years longer than the one-month ban itself. It took until this year, 2026, for the federal court to finally hand down its last word on that saga, dismissing the industry's appeal and ruling that live exports in the years following the ban weren't materially affected after all, even though compensation running into the hundreds of millions of dollars had already been paid out along the way. That fight dragged on for 15 years. There's a pattern here that cattle families recognize all too well, even if the details change from decade to decade. A policy gets announced in Canberra, often with good intentions behind it, aimed at a genuine problem somewhere in the system. Farm groups scramble to understand what it actually means for their members. Lobbying begins. Concessions get won, sometimes RIA, L in meaningful ones, and the government gets to describe the final outcome as balanced and fair. But underneath the headline, wins, the fundamental uncertainty rarely fully disappears, and families are left running the numbers on their own specific situation for years afterward, never entirely sure whether the ground has finished moving beneath them. The live export ban took over a decade to fully resolve in the courts. The trust and capital gains reforms are still being finalized in Parliament as this goes to air, with key thresholds still unsettled and major provisions not due to take effect until the middle of 2027. History suggests cattle families shouldn't expect total clarity anytime soon. What's genuinely at stake here goes well beyond a single family's tax bill, as significant as that bill can be. It's about whether the basic mechanism that has let Australian cattle properties move from parent to child, generation after generation, for well over a century, still actually functions the way families need it to. Farming has never been an easy way to build wealth. It's slow, it's exposed to drought and flood and collapsing. Markets completely outside anyone's control, and the returns can take a full generation to materialize. The trust structures and the old capital gain settings weren't loopholes dreamed up to dodge fair taxation. For most cattle families, they were simply the practical machinery that made it possible to keep land in the family without a tax bill big enough to force a sale the moment someone died or decided to retire. Now that machinery is being rebuilt in real time, with farm groups fighting for every concession and every carve-out along the way, while the underlying legislation is still being finalized in Canberra. The trust carve-out for direct farming income was a genuine and important win. The lift in the small business turnover threshold was another real win. But the pre-1985 land revaluation is still coming. The loss of the 50% capital. Gains discount in favor of indexation is still coming. And that frozen $6 million asset threshold is still sitting there, untouched and unresolved. For cattle families across Australia, the fight over exactly how this reform lands isn't a distant policy debate happening somewhere else. It's a live question about who gets to keep the land their families have worked for generations, and who ends up being forced to sell it off just to pay a tax bill they never saw coming. And right now, with the legislation still being shaped and the final details still being fought over in Parliament, nobody, not the farmers, not their accountants, and not even the government itself, can say with total certainty exactly how the story ends. For a man standing in a paddock with his 4 daughters, that uncertainty isn't an abstract policy debate. It's the question of whether the land he spent his life building will still belong to his family when those daughters are old enough to decide whether they want it.